very recently, the brand new game Dispatch came out. It is an adventure game, I think is reasonably fair to say, in the style of the Telltale games. Weird to call them classics, but I suppose you'd probably call them classics at this point. Like The Walking Dead, Tales from the Borderlands, Wolf Among Us. And it is a superhero workplace comedy with a very irreverent sense of humor. And the reason that we've been bringing up, if you're not familiar with the game, the reason that we've been bringing up Critical Role is because Critical Role served as the publisher for Dispatch, which will kind of feed into some of the larger conversation we're going to have, because for a variety of reasons, and in the face of a fair amount of adversity because of its presentation and episodic release structure and the sort of waning industry interest in single player exclusive buy it once and be done with it sort of titles. In spite of all of that, the game is a massive success. Adhoc Studios, I believe this is their first title. They're founded by, industry veterans, and we'll get into that a little bit, but the game is doing exceptionally well. It's sold over 1 million copies, and its all-time peak on Steam was over 200,000 players. And then Zach, you pulled some really interesting review data as well, right?
Yeah, on Steam, it's got overwhelmingly positive, which is mostly interesting because for games that attract a lot of players, unless they're like super indie darlings, I feel like they more so end up in the, is it very positive? It's whatever is under overwhelmingly. Like overwhelmingly positive, I think you have to have over 95% positive reviews, maybe a little bit higher than that. Dispatch is currently sitting at 97%. And there have been 48,000 people that have reviewed this game. It's just like a crazy amount of people to be positively reviewing this game, and a crazy amount of people to not be negatively reviewing this game. It just, even if it was a fantastic game, I feel like once you kind of get a critical amount of attention, it's really hard to keep overwhelmingly positive. So TLDR, pretty impressive. And we'll talk a little bit about the actual gameplay itself and what our thoughts are and whatnot, but it is a good game. I do think it's a good game.
Yeah. It's rock solid. If you're the sort of person who enjoys choose your own adventure stuff, games where, even what seem like very small decisions can have, small to very large impacts on the overall story, then yeah, it's absolutely worth checking out. It's reasonably priced for, I think, 8 or 9 episodes, each one being about an hour and a half of gameplay, and story and whatnot. It's only $30. And obviously we're not sponsored by them, so we're not like incentivized to sell you the game. But if it is the sort of game that strikes your fancy as it strikes mine, then there's not been a better example of a game like this, in my opinion, for years.
Yeah, it's very interesting to see this genre come back, especially because I don't know that I'd call them my favorite games, but I really loved The Wolf Among Us, and I really loved Tales from the Borderlands. Specifically, Tales from the Borderlands is probably a contender for my favorite game in that IP. Borderlands 2 is really good, but Tales from the Borderlands, it's just so fucking good. If you haven't played Tales, it is such a fantastic game. I did watch some old cutscenes. It does look a little bit dated because it is older. But God, Telltale. It is so fucking good. And it's got, who's the guy that voices Kronk in The Emperor's New Groove? I always forget his name.
Patrick Warburton?
Yeah, it's got Patrick Warburton in it. He's one of the main antagonists for a while. It's so fucking good. So highly recommend checking out that game. But yes, this is very much a spiritual successor of that. And part of the reason for that is because a lot of the leadership at Adhoc are actually former Telltale developers. Specifically, the guys that came up a lot in the articles that we were reading are Nick Herman, who is the COO, Dennis Lennart, who is the CTO, and Pierre Charette. who I also probably butchered that last name, who's the Chief Creative Officer, or CCO. Also, as I mentioned to you, Aaron, they've probably corrected this, but I still think it's funny that IGN called it Nick Herma. They just fucking forgot the N.
I was about to say that you also butchered Nick Herma's name because IGN couldn't have gotten that wrong.
Yeah, you're right.
It must be Nick Herma.
See, the sad thing is Nick also spelled his name wrong on LinkedIn then when I looked. So that's really awkward, Nick. You might want to check that out.
That's because he needed an editor and IGN was busy.
Fair enough. So true. But yeah, no, it's like doing super, super duper well. I do think it's kind of interesting. I was looking at Steam just a second ago, Aaron. So Adhoc is actually listed as the publisher on the Steam page, but Critical Role definitely took some kind of at least financial publishing over for the game. For those that don't know, there's a Bloomberg article that recently came out like a day or two ago from Jason Schreier, as of us recording this. So it's going to be a little bit
I recently read an article that I'm paraphrasing here, but I think that Jason Schreier in this article was described or credited as industry things knower.
That's pretty sick. I mean, look, where's the lie?
It's true. It's a very accurate description of Mr. Schreier's position in the industry. But yeah, he's a games industry things knower.
I do like that when you become so like ridiculously well known, your titles just become so stupid. Like you've got a certain amount of professionalism you need as like a newbie, and then you reach a certain point of popularity or knowing of things, and you just get like the most ridiculous title. But regardless of any of that, he had an article that came out, and it's pretty cool. It talks about kind of the formation of this game, how this game came about. And one of the really interesting things about it is that I think they ran into some pretty substantial financial problems. From what we could gather online, it sounds like the main founders didn't take pay for like 6 months. It was like a 30 developer studio, and the main founders weren't getting paid for a portion so that other people could continue to make money on the project. And I think that's when they met up with Critical Role, and Critical Role was like, hey, if you make a game for us, we'll help fund this final stretch of Dispatch. And, we'll form this like really great partnership. And obviously Critical Role is very interested in like the choose your own adventure narrative space.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, the story there goes that, at a certain point, money had essentially dried up. There were some decisions to be made, and Critical Role came in to provide, last minute funding to get the game over the finish line in exchange for Adhoc developing a new game, presumably in one of the IPs owned by Critical Role, at some point down the line once everything is wrapped up with Dispatch. And again, that will sort of feed into a lot of some of the stuff that we talk about here in a couple of minutes. But yeah, that seems to be the extra sort of sauce that got them through the last hurdles of development. And it's also worth pointing out that a fair amount of the voice cast, or at least some people in the voice cast, including one very prominent person, Laura Bailey, who is a cast member of Critical Role. A fair number of people are involved in Critical Role in some way, or related to that property, who lent their voices to characters in the game. And Critical Role is, of course, known for having a stable of extremely talented performers at their disposal. That's part of the appeal of the show, based on my understanding of it.
Yeah, I mean, that's basically it. It's like, what if these like famous people that you hear in all of your anime, video games, insert whatever, were on like a single network playing nerdy ass TTRPGs? That's a massive, portion of the sell. So yeah, no, it's super cool to see this all come together. I think kind of the funny thing about the story is, as I mentioned, based on reading the story, Nick, Dennis, and Pierre all left Telltale to work at Ubisoft in 2017 on what might be the closest thing to a choose your own adventure game, Splinter Cell. You know, the amount of times that I've thought while playing The Wolf Among Us that it was similar to Splinter Cell is truly crazy. And being a jackass aside, I am very curious. Like, look, I haven't looked at Nick or Dennis's or Pierre's like full bona fides, what they've worked on. Obviously, they're very accomplished game devs. They've made this game that's very successful. I just think it's really funny to hire a group of dudes that were working on very much not a stealth, like, shooter third person game and then be like, y'all want to make fucking Splinter Cell? Like,
yeah,
it's that Ubisoft magic, baby.
Yeah, Ubisoft is very good at allocating resources. I mean, I don't know. I guess my thought there would be like, if some people who are accomplished storytellers and accomplished game devs left a high profile studio, and I thought that they could bring, you know, even if, you know, the number of times that I've played Splinter Cell and been like, ah, man, the weight of my decisions, my choices, so narratively important to Sam Fisher's story. I haven't thought that many times while playing Splinter Cell. You know, so even if the sort of like narrative forward element of Telltale wouldn't be present, it's possible that, you know, they were relying on these guys for organizational chops or, you know, just like general narrative ability in order to make a compelling story. Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's not to say that you couldn't have transferable skills, but considering that it is the year 2025 and no new Splinter Cell projects have materialized, I think you can probably tell about how well that reboot of Splinter Cell went.
I do want to clarify that was not their fault. It did not work out. That was Ubisoft getting in its own way. And actually, to their credit, it sounds like they were actually very excited to work on kind of bringing back Splinter Cell, since it's such a big franchise that's kind of been neglected because Ubisoft is stinky doo-doo, to put it politically or scientifically. Anyway.
Yeah, but then that project, as I recall, sort of morphed into the now defunct live service shooter X Defiant, which we all miss terribly. I know there's a hole in my life that only X Defiant has ever been able to fill. I've never played X Defiant, but I'm assuming that's what that was meant for. And then I also believe that the guys then went on to sort of do contract work, writing for Wolf Among Us 2 and some of the newer Telltale properties after the studio was revived following its closure. But then I guess they sort of parted ways with that team due to creative differences after writing, I believe, an 800-page script, and not being satisfied with the the collaboration. So I think they stepped away from that and started up Adhoc, and the rest is history.
Yeah, I think my last comment that I would just make before we get into some more of the meat and potatoes of this whole thing is I've been thinking a lot about, I talked with you a little bit about it, Aaron. I've been thinking a lot about alternative funding / publishing models in like the last year. And the story as it's delivered by games media is that, Adhoc and Critical Role were really like a match made in heaven in terms of like their objectives, their critical understanding of what's successful and whatnot. And the reason I bring this up is because a lot of the narrative behind Dispatch is them going to try and get funding in an admittedly very difficult to get funding world, and being told like by investors, this is not a genre of game where people have an interest. This genre of game is failing. Look at X game that failed. Look at Y game that failed, etc. And it's interesting because in the article, the developers are like, yeah, well, we can look at those games and be like, that's that was just not a creatively good game. I think I forgot what the exact example is. Oh, it was like, if you look at a movie, right? Like if one movie failed in like a horror movie genre or something, or just in general, like you wouldn't stop trying to make a movie because a bad movie failed. You would just make a good movie. And I feel like sometimes maybe it is a little bit difficult to differentiate between the two things. Like, I know there are certainly some genres that I think are struggling. For example, like the RTS genre, I think has really evolved. I don't know that a pure RTS has a huge market to it. But like, going back to my original point about publishing, it's just such a good example of like why we should not rely on these investors that are not tied to games, that have no idea what the fuck they're talking about, that just are in it for money, because they're so wrong about this game, right? And we all have our blind spots. You know, maybe I shouldn't fund RTSs because I'm an idiot and don't know anything about RTSs. But my point here is like going to some kind of alternative method where it's like crowdfunded even maybe, or like people are the ones that dictate where the money goes to what projects and whatever. That just seems so much more stable to me, because so many of these corporate suits have no idea what people actually want. They're just trying to make the quickest bang for their buck. And if, you know, Critical Role hadn't stepped in as this like partner that really understood what was going on, sounds like Dispatch may have never come out.
Yeah. I think that's a fair read on the situation, and it was something that had popped up in my mind as well when we were, you know, sort of initially talking about this and getting a little bit deeper into Critical Role's involvement. There is something. I mean, it's all the sort of ebb and flow of money. But if we're talking about, and not to take this to like the logical extreme, but if we flash back to our most recent episode about the EA buyout, where I spent a little bit of time very unfocusedly sort of blathering about thinking about where the money is coming from for your game project, and thinking about what money is behind the games that you purchase and play, whether, you know, there's anything actionable to be done with that information, just sort of understanding it as part of a larger contextual understanding of the media you consume is worthwhile in its own endeavor. To that note, for something like this, where you have what is ostensibly a niche game in a niche genre playing to a fairly committed but arguably not massive potential audience of people who like single-player only games, narrative single-player only games, choose-your-own-adventure games, Telltale-style choose-your-own-adventure games, and games that are released in an episodic structure rather than all at once, you know, to be styled after a TV show, where in a world where even TV shows don't necessarily always release things episodically anymore. A lot of the time, even if they are released in episodes, they're released in episodes in one big collection. So yeah, looking at, you know, all of those various different things that sort of push Dispatch into niche territory, it does make sense that the larger investors who are going to be interested in the highest return on their investment would be looking at, you know, live service and multiplayer and anything that you can jam microtransactions into rather than this. And the idea that then this game would find funding from a by no means small, but originally sort of, you know, grassroots project that was, you know, started not by, you know, Sony or Disney or something like that, but by a group of enthusiasts who just so happen to be talented and potentially well connected. It does start to feel like the good world version of the look at where the money's coming from, because there is so much creative synergy between, like you said, the goals and the objectives and the narrative passions and various interests and whatnot of these two groups. It just feels right that Critical Role would take an interest in this. And it's interesting to me to think about what that sort of model would look like replicated throughout the industry, where these smaller projects can receive attention, funding, and even potentially like boosts in marketing from their association with organizations on the level of Critical Role, which again is to say not enormous, but still big enough to fund a game. So it is smaller in scale than an investment from Tencent, but the money itself feels like it was put to good use by people who actually gave a shit. And I don't think I can stress enough how abnormal that is to talk about in 2025. And I'm sure that there's some grim realities of business going on behind the scenes that would make this all seem a lot less pleasant. But at least at face value, in terms of how it's being reported and talked about by basically everybody involved at this point, that's just refreshing to me and cool. And just, this is lovely to have something nice to talk about when it comes to money and investment for once.
Yeah, no, it really is a cool situation to see these two largely like grassroots companies, organizations come together and support each other in this kind of a way. It'll be interesting to see what they end up doing with Critical Role's IP. Presumably it will be, some Dungeons and Dragon fantasy adjacent game. I'm assuming it's going to be in Exandria probably, which is their main world that most of the Critical Role stuff happens in, or at least the big campaigns. I guess we'll see. But it's definitely cool to see that collaboration and how beneficial it was for everybody involved.